This is Still Unanswered. I'm Danielle Rhodes. Today, we're going back to Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s to a set of murders that terrorized Black working-class neighborhoods, then largely faded from national memory. 6 girls, ages 10 to 18, taken on ordinary errands and found dumped along the city's commuter arteries. The killer left a note, a taunt, and then vanished. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom.
I'm Marcus Ellison. When you say Freeway Phantom, you're naming, for the first time in our city's history, a suspected serial offender operating before the language, the databases, and frankly, the investigative playbook for serial crime were commonplace. The case sits at the intersection of forensics, geography, and social neglect.
6 Black girls: Carol Denise Spinks, Darlenia Denise Johnson, Brenda Faye Crockett, Nenomisha Yates, Brenda Denise Woodard, and Diane Denise Williams. Those names matter. We'll walk through who they were, how they disappeared, and how the city, the police, and the media responded. But before that, Marcus, can you set the scene for listeners? What was Washington like in 1971 and 72?
D.C. was in flux. By the mid-1970s, it became known as Chocolate City, a majority Black city in the making, and the murders occurred just as the city was shifting toward more local control, but federal oversight still loomed. Crime rates were rising nationally. Heroin and street violence were on people's minds. Add to that a deep distrust of police in many Black neighborhoods, southeast, northeast, where most victims lived. That combination changed how families reacted and how investigators engaged.
Right. And those neighborhoods, Congress Heights, the Benning Road Corridor, parts of Northwest near Cardozo, these were everyday places. Corner stores, bus stops, block parties. That's what makes this so painful. These were girls doing ordinary things, buying sugar, getting groceries, heading to a summer job. Marcus, tell us how the crime started to look connected.
It's a grimly precise pattern. The victims were all Black females between 10 and 18. Most were abducted while on short trips, walking to a store, boarding a bus, heading to work. Bodies almost always turned up along major commuter routes: I-295, Pennsylvania Avenue, the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, Route 50. A recurring cause of death was strangulation, and there was an unsettling signature. Most victims were found without shoes. When pattern recognition finally coalesced, after a few bodies, the press coined the name Freeway Phantom, and investigators began to see a single predator rather than isolated tragedies.
Let's put names and dates into listeners' ears. Carol Denise Spinks, 13, was the first recognized victim. April 25, 1971. She's sent to a 7-Eleven just over the D.C.-Maryland line, half a mile from home. 6 days later, her body is found near I-295, south of Suitland Parkway, close to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. She'd been assaulted, strangled, kept alive for days, and was found fully clothed but missing her shoes. Marcus, that detail, missing shoes, how did detectives interpret it?
Missing shoes became one of the early threads that tied cases together. There are different ways to interpret it: trophies, a fetish, an attempt to delay identification, or even a ritualistic choice by the killer. The consistency across several bodies suggested it was purposeful rather than accidental. But remember, exceptions existed. Brenda Woodard later was found wearing her shoes, so the pattern raised questions about single versus multiple offenders or evolution in M.O.
July 8, 1971, Darlenia Denise Johnson, 16, walking to a summer job, disappears. Her body turns up 11 days later, about 15 feet from Carol Spinks's dump site. There was an anonymous call with a specific location that wasn't acted on quickly enough. That delay, Listeners, I want you to hear that word, delay. It matters.
It matters a lot. Delays like that cost forensic opportunity. Darlania's body was highly decomposed when found. Critical evidence that could have told us more about her attacker was lost to time and heat. And from an investigative point of view, the fact that two bodies were found so close geographically implies the offender both knew those locations and was comfortable using them repeatedly. That suggests local familiarity, someone who understood the freeway access ramps, the back roads, how to pull off without attracting attention.
July 27, 1971. Brenda Faye Crockett, just 10 years old, sent to a nearby store in Northwest near Cardozo. This one it has those chilling phone calls. About 2 hours after Brenda disappears, the family phone rings, answered by her 7-year-old sister. Brenda, terrified, says a white man picked her up in a white car and that the guy was taking her home. She says she's in a house, then bye. The phone rings again later. Similar story. Her family believes those calls were dictated by the kidnapper. Marcus, what are investigators' takes on why he'd force a child to call home?
In cases like this, coerced phone calls can serve several purposes. Practically, they buy the offender time, delaying searches or creating a false timeline. Psychologically, it's a form of domination, controlling not only the victim, but the victim's family and the investigators through misdirection. The white man detail in this series is widely believed to be a lie forced by the offender, possibly to mislead police or encourage a racialized line of inquiry that would send detectives down the wrong path.
2 hours. That's all. 2 hours between being sent to the store and the first desperate call. Brenda's body was found early the next morning along Route 50 in Prince George's County. She had been raped and strangled. A scarf was knotted around her neck. That scarf becomes part of the mental image of the phantom, this person who staged things, who played games. Okay, Nenomisha Yates, Neno, October 1, 1971. 12 years old, sent to Safeway on Benning Road, NE, at about 7 p.m. Her father was at the hospital. Her stepmom had just given birth. She never returned. 2 hours later, a 16-year-old boy finds her still warm along Pennsylvania Avenue.
With Neno Yates, investigators recovered distinctive green synthetic fibers on her clothing, fibers that later matched fibers found in other victims. That's the kind of physical clue that suggests a shared environment, car upholstery, carpeting, a specific garment. In the early 70s, fiber analysis existed, but the databases and cross-jurisdictional sharing were primitive compared to today. Those fibers should have been a major lead. They were, but without a good suspect or a comparable sample in a database, they couldn't point to a person by name.
October's murder public awareness shifts. The press begins to suspect a single killer. The name Freeway Phantom appears. November 15th and 16th, 1971. Brenda Denise Woodard, 18, gets off a bus around 11:30 p.m. She never arrives home. At about 6 a.m., her body is found near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. She's been stabbed multiple times in addition to being strangled. A coat lay over her chest. Crucially, there's a note in her pocket, written on her own school notebook paper, signed Freeway Phantom. Marcus, the note's language, tantamount? That word becomes a focal point, right?
Correct. The note read, in part, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." The spelling and odd capitalization drew attention. Tantamount is not a common word. Detectives later connected that word to a suspect, Robert Askins, because he reportedly used that vocabulary frequently. But linkages like that are circumstantial. It raises suspicion, yes, but it doesn't prove authorship. Still, it's one of the clearest instances where a linguistic quirk became central to suspecting an individual.
And then, September 5, 1972, Diane Denise Williams, 17, cooks dinner, visits her boyfriend, boards a bus around 11:20 p.m., and is found a few hours later along I-295. Strangled. Shoes missing. That is the last generally recognized Freeway Phantom victim. After that, the city waits, and the killer stops, or changes his pattern, or is arrested for something else, or dies. We don't know.
The stoppage is a classic puzzle in serial patterns. Offenders can stop for many reasons: incarceration, death, relocation, or simply choosing different victimology. Some investigators think the Phantom's knowledge of freeways and access ramps points to someone whose night movements weren't suspicious, maybe a commuter, a truck driver, or even someone with law enforcement familiarity. But again, that's inference from geography combined with behavior, not proof.
Let's talk about the investigation, the things that were done and the things that went wrong. Multiple agencies were involved: MPD, Prince George's County Police, and coordination was inconsistent. The bodies were found in both D.C. and Prince George's County. Marcus, how did jurisdictional complexity affect this case?
It was a real problem. Today, we have more formalized task forces and databases like VICAP. Back then, the mindset was siloed. MPD and PGPD had overlapping responsibilities, and coordination could be competitive or simply clumsy. Evidence sharing, fiber analysis, witness statements didn't always happen efficiently. Time and again in cases like this, jurisdictional friction slows pattern recognition, which in turn costs forensic opportunities and can let an offender exploit gaps.
And then there's the social context. These were Black girls from working-class neighborhoods. Families later said they felt the case didn't receive the urgency it deserved, that if these had been white suburban children, the national attention and resources would have been different. The Washington Post asked that question directly in 2018. Marcus, how does systemic bias show up in an investigation like this?
Systemic bias can be subtle and institutional. It shows up in resource allocation, how much manpower and how quickly detectives are assigned. It shows in media interest, which can pressure agencies to act. It shows in the assumption set that investigators bring. Is this a local street crime or something that warrants a special task force? In the early 70s, Black neighborhoods were often treated as crime sources rather than communities deserving of full protective investment. That context likely affected investigative prioritization and public memory.
Yeah. There were also tragic missteps, like the anonymous call about Darlenia's body that wasn't followed up on quickly enough. Families still ask, why did police delay? Why did it seem like detectives missed opportunities? Those lapses haunt these families.
They do, and beyond delays, evidence handling of the era was limited. DNA didn't exist. Forensic standards have evolved hugely since then. Some items, fiber samples, clothing, may still exist in evidence lockers, but degradation and loss are real barriers. Also, false confessions and unreliable tips crowded investigators early on, which can waste months chasing leads that lead nowhere.
Let's move into suspects and theories. No one was ever charged in the Freeway Phantom murders, but multiple suspects or suspect groups were investigated. First, the Green Vega Rapists, an informal name given to a violent gang operating around the Beltway, whose members were convicted of abductions and rapes around the same era. Marcus, why were they considered potential phantom perpetrators?
Their M.O., abducting women near highways and raping them, overlapped with aspects of the Phantom series. Police interviewed several gang members at Lorden Prison. One inmate reportedly gave details about a Beltway homicide that sounded like a phantom killing and provided non-public details. But that confessional line broke down when a political candidate publicly outed the informant's existence, which shut down further cooperation. Without corroborating physical evidence, the leads didn't produce prosecutions.
Politics derailed a jailhouse lead. Unbelievable.
It happens all too often. confidential informants need protections, and when those are breached, informants withdraw. That can cost cases decade-long windows.
There was also a theory involving ex-cops, Edward Leonard Selman and Tommy Bernard Simmons, arrested in connection with the murder of Angela Denise Barnes, a girl whose killing overlapped with the Phantom timeline, before investigators determined Barnes wasn't a Phantom victim. Marcus, why did ex-cops come under suspicion?
Insider knowledge is a plausible route. Someone with policing experience or someone who worked night shifts could navigate freeway ramps and late-night stops without raising suspicion. Selman and Simmons were linked to Angela Barnes's murder, which initially resembled Phantom cases, and that triggered broader inquiries. But once Barnes was classified as unrelated and given confessions to her murder, no direct tie to the Core Six was established.
And then there's Robert Elwood Askins. This is one of those names that makes your skin tighten. Born 1919, with violent crimes dating to 1938. He served cyanide-laced whiskey to sex workers. He stabbed a woman. He was committed to St. Elizabeth's and later released. By the 1970s, he's a computer technician at the National Science Foundation. Marcus, Askins became a major suspect. Why?
Several reasons. Askins had a long history of violence against women and a documented hatred toward them. When detectives searched him in 1978 for links to the Phantom, they found items that raised red flags: photographs of young women, scarves, and other objects. The linguistic link is significant. Tantamount appears both in the Phantom note and in documents and speech associated with Askins. Colleagues said he used that word frequently. That rare word made him stand out. But crucially, there was no conclusive physical evidence, no blood, DNA, or fibers directly connecting him to the victims. He was never charged for the Phantom killings and died in prison in 2010, having been convicted for other violent crimes.
So Askins is plausible in many ways. History, vocabulary, presence in D.C., but inconclusive. That's what drives the frustration. Plausible suspects with circumstantial threads, but nothing that meets the standard for an arrest and conviction. Marcus, are there other theories we should walk listeners through?
Yes, there's the single versus multiple offender debate. Some argue the Core Six are the work of one person because of consistent victim profile, geography, and strangulation. Others point to differences: Woodard's stabbing, the presence of shoes in her case, the note, and say perhaps there was a copycat or a separate killer. There's also the truck driver or commuter theory, someone whose night movements through the Beltway didn't draw attention. And the unsettling possibility: the killer could have been a member of law enforcement or security with a level of movement and authority that camouflaged their crimes. None of these theories can be proven with available public evidence.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's talk about media and memory. These murders were covered in the press at the time, local papers, some national attention, but coverage was episodic, sometimes sensationalized around the nickname Freeway Phantom, and then it faded. Marcus, how different might the response have been if the victims were white suburban children?
We can't answer definitively, but history shows a pattern. Crimes involving white suburban children tend to generate faster federal attention, larger task forces, and more sustained national coverage. Families in this case, and later journalists, have observed that the level of urgency, resource devotion, and sustained investigative pressure might have been different. That's part of the broader critique. Whose tragedies become national preoccupations, and whose are allowed, effectively, to be local problems?
Right.
Right.
I want to center the families here. These are not just case files. Parents, siblings, and communities have lived with this trauma for decades. They describe constant what-ifs, and in some cases, guilt for having sent their daughters to the store. Brenda Crockett's family in particular has talked about the phone calls that haunt them. Did Brenda lie on the phone to protect them? Did the killer force the script? Those are lifelong wounds. Marcus, do you find that investigators sometimes lose sight of the families in these long investigations?
It can happen. Long investigations get buried under case files and paperwork. Detectives rotate. Institutional memory frays. From a criminological perspective, keeping family contact and trust is essential, not only ethically, but because families can be sources of information years later. The family's distrust in this case is understandable, given perceived lapses and dismissive attitudes they say they encountered early on. That broken trust makes cold case work exponentially harder down the line.
There's also the long arc of modern forensics. Could this be solved now? We hear that question a lot on this show. The answer is maybe. Some biological evidence, like semen, was reported in a couple of cases. Fibers were preserved. Marcus, what are the modern possibilities?
If biological material from the perpetrator still exists and was preserved, there are techniques today, touch DNA, YSTR analysis, and genetic genealogy that weren't available in the 1970s. The Golden State Killer case showed what's possible when investigators get a usable genetic signal and the legal and funding framework to pursue genealogy. But success depends on evidence condition, chain of custody, and whether the right databases can be accessed. Also, institutions must prioritize and fund the work. It isn't a guaranteed path, but it's a real hope.
And MPD and Prince George's County still list this among cold cases and have offered rewards, up to $150,000 according to public statements, for information leading to arrest and conviction. So there's at least a public incentive, even if the day-to-day investigative resources have been limited. Marcus, what's the realistic chance that an old fiber or a preserved scarf could still yield DNA?
Realistically, it's uncertain. Fibers themselves don't yield DNA, but clothing can. If items were stored properly, avoidance of heat, moisture, contaminants, it's possible to extract touch DNA even decades later. But degradation and contamination are major hurdles. Many cold cases are solved that way, but many are not. The underlying factor is resource commitment. Evidence must be systematically reviewed, samples sent to labs, and genetic genealogy teams engaged. That takes money, political will, and time.
We've described suspects, Green Vega Gang, ex-cops, Askins. We've described missteps, delayed searches, siloed agencies, and a cultural devaluation of Black victims' lives. We've talked fibers and the rare word tantamount. So where does that leave us? How should listeners think about justice in a case that's now over 50 years cold?
We have to hold two facts at once. One, there's procedural failure and systemic bias that likely hampered the investigation. Two, there are real investigative leads, linguistic clues, fibers, geographic patterns that justify continued inquiry. Justice can mean many things. Arrest and conviction, yes, but also acknowledgement, renewed investigation, improved evidence review, and listening to families. We should also pressure institutions to use modern tools where possible and to be transparent about what steps they're taking.
It's infuriating to think about these girls being treated as less than, less deserving of urgency. But there is a thin thread of cautious hope. Recent podcasts, long-form reporting, and public interest have pushed the case back into conversation. The Tenderfoot TV podcast, the Washington Post piece in 2018, these reopen memory and can push institutions. Marcus, have you seen media attention make a practical difference in cold cases like this?
Absolutely. Media attention can produce new witnesses, people who remembered an odd car or a neighbor who moved suddenly. It can also prod police departments to reallocate resources and encourage donations or private funding for advanced testing. But there's a flip side. Sensational coverage can re-traumatize families. That's why victim-centered, responsible journalism, like the pieces that have resurfaced the Freeway Phantom, is essential. It balances investigation with empathy.
We also need to be clear about ethics. We must center the girls, their lives, their families, not the killer's lurid details. We must avoid sensationalism, respect ongoing grief, and call out systemic racism in law enforcement when we see it. Listeners, if you know anything, contact MPD or Prince George's County cold case units. There's a reward. There's a possibility, however small, that a scrap of evidence could connect to a living relative through genealogy and finally give a name to this story. Marcus, final thoughts on where the case sits now?
It sits as a haunting, unresolved chapter in the city's history. We have leads that were promising then and that could still be useful now. Green fibers, the note, witness statements. We also have the reality of degradation and lost opportunity. The best path forward is methodical. Inventory remaining evidence, assess viability for DNA extraction, and, if appropriate, pursue genetic genealogy within legal constraints. Simultaneously, maintain open channels with families and the public so that any new memory or tip is captured.
Before we close, I want to read the victims' names again, slowly, because names are resistance to erasure. Carol Denise Spinks, Darlania Denise Johnson, Brenda Faye Crockett, Nenomisha Yates, Brenda Denise Woodard, Diane Denise Williams. 6 girls, 6 stories, 6 families who deserve answers.
6 lives.
If you take anything from this episode, let it be this. Unsolved doesn't mean forgotten. Silence can be an active choice by institutions and society. It is our responsibility to keep asking, to keep pushing, and to keep the memory of these girls alive. Marcus, any last piece of context you'd offer for listeners who want to understand the bigger patterns at play here?
Yes. Cases like the Freeway Phantom teach us about how investigative frameworks evolve. In the 1970s, we didn't have national databases, DNA, or the vocabulary for a coordinated serial investigation. Those gaps matter, but they also remind us that victims' race and class affected how resources flowed. True justice now means using modern tools, but also acknowledging past institutional neglect and committing to do better for communities that were and still are marginalized.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you to listeners for sitting with us through something heavy and necessary. If you want to learn more, the Metropolitan Police Department's cold case pages list the Freeway Phantom among active inquiries and detail the reward. There are also deep reporting projects, Tenderfoot's podcast and the Washington Post piece, that expand on what we covered. We'll leave those links in the episode notes.
One more thing. If you're a listener with archival skills or a background in forensics and you want to volunteer pro bono, cold cases sometimes advance because people with expertise donate time. Reach out to your local cold case unit and ask how you can help.
Marcus, always thinking like a professor and an activist. All right, next episode we'll return to another case that never made the headlines it deserved. Until then, I'm Danielle Rhodes.
I'm Marcus Ellison. Thank you for listening. Remember the girls. Demand accountability. Stay curious and kind.
Bye.